No spoilers ahead.
I'm Jonny. Welcome to my house of horrors.
I'm a fan of a lot of vampire movies. I'm not going to pretend I love them all, but as arguably the first horror subgenre, I feel I should pay my respects as a horror fan. And speaking of firsts, the movie we're looking at today holds the title of first popular vampire movie. There were one or two attempts before it, but they're mostly considered lost films and nobody really knows much about them. Nosferatu was originally released in 1922, and 100 years later, its influences are everywhere in vampire movies. Now, it is true, many of its more unique elements are a direct result of an attempt to avoid certain legal ramifications, but we'll talk about that later on. In the meantime, let's take a closer look at the movie that kicked off all of this neck-sucking stuff. Sort of.
The plot.
The story takes place in 1838 in the fictional town of Wisberg, Germany. Germany is a real country. It's the Wisberg part that's made up. See? My videos are entertaining and informative. Thomas Hutter's sent to Transylvania by his boss, Herr Nock, who's an estate agent and a seriously creepy fucker. Thomas's boss suggests selling the Count the house directly across the street from Thomas's current house. And isn't that always the way? When foreign vampires move into the neighborhood, it's always right across the street. When he finally hits the Carpathian Mountains, Thomas pops into the local Marriott Inn. And when he drops Count Orlok's name in hopes of gaining himself some street cred, the locals collectively wet their black and white pants. And when he's back in his room later that night, he finds a book about vampires. But Thomas is a real estate agent, so he's not going to allow obvious foreshadowing or collective local wisdom to get between him and his potential commission. So he heads off to the castle on a coach, but the coach driver refuses to take him all the way. Courageous and tenacious and greedy, Thomas travels the rest of the way on foot until he's greeted by none other than Count Orlok himself. The meal arrives eventually, and when Thomas accidentally slices his thumb trying to cut some naan bread to dip into his chicken tikka, Orlok totally invades Thomas's personal space when he tries going in for the old sneaky thumb suck. Shocked that the Count didn't bother with small talk first, Thomas pulls his hand away and backs up far enough to make it obvious he's not into it. But hinting wasn't really a thing in Transylvanian culture at the time, so the Count just follows him. Somehow, during the most intense moment of Thomas's life, he manages to fall asleep in the chair. And the next morning, when he wakes up, he finds a fresh pair of puncture holes on his neck, which he forces himself to believe came from a massive mosquito, because if he acknowledged the obvious, he'd probably run screaming like a terrified child, and real estate agents don't do that. Later that night, when it's totally not awkward at all between them, Orlok signs the requisite paperwork for the purchase of the house. And after he does, he notices a picture of Thomas's wife, Ellen. When the Count tells him that, Thomas still chooses money over honor and self-preservation when he decides not to punch the Count right in his pointy nose. Later that night, Thomas reads the book he lifted from the Marriott, and the book makes him start to think maybe the Count is a vampire. And if he's only starting to think that now, it makes you think it must have been very easy to get real estate licenses in 1838. Thomas falls to pieces in his room, and then the door opens and Count Orlok comes in with the Transylvanian version of Come Hither eyes, which are remarkably similar to the eyes men in Western cultures make to announce they've just had their first prostate exam. With no other option, Thomas hides under the covers until he faints, probably from the fumes of shitting the bed. Meanwhile, way back in fictional town Germany, Thomas's wife Ellen suddenly springs up in bed, doing her best Anna Kendrick face. She walks to the balcony in a trance. Fortunately, Thomas's friend, Dr. Harding, sees what's happening and rushes in to help. And when he arrives, she's doing a tight wire act on the railing. She's brought safely back into bed where she shouts Thomas's name, as though she can see Count Orlok back in his castle. The next day, Thomas has a stroll around the castle. It's filled with lovely dusty stones and bits of dead straw, and there's a coffin that Count Orlok's in. Having had enough fun with tourist spots for the day, Thomas sprints back to his room, and once he's there, he watches as Count Orlok fills a coach full of coffins, before he climbs into the last one himself. And as the procession departs, Thomas finally clues into what's happening. The coffin ends up on a schooner, and almost everyone on that schooner ends up dead while Orlok's taking his afternoon nap. Naturally suspicious, the first mate decides to look further into it by going down below. And once he's down below, the first mate stumbles into one of the most iconic moments in horror history. And when the terrifying trawler finally winds up in Wisberg, Germany, Count Orlok sneaks all the way to his new house across from Thomas's, carrying one of his coffins. And nobody notices. After Orlok's given the place a coat of paint and a few nice throw pillows, lots of the local folk start dying, but the town doctor's confident it's nothing to worry about. Against Thomas's instructions, because who'd really listen to the guy now, Ellen reads the book Thomas stole from the Marriott. She learns vampires can be beaten if a pure-hearted woman distracts the vampire with her good looks. Always the proactive one, and perhaps slightly big-headed for declaring herself pure of heart and good-looking, Ellen opens her window to invite Count Orlok in. But then she faints. Proactively faints, I mean. And when Thomas wakes her up, she tells him to go and get the doctor immediately. When he leaves, Orlok comes in and drinks her blood. But cunning Ellen's outsmarted the Count. She's offered her good-looking neck as a sacrifice. The sun's coming up, and Orlok's too focused on the love bites to notice the danger. So the sun hits poor Count Orlok, and he vanishes in a poof of smoke. Proactive, possibly big-headed Ellen survives just long enough to embrace the man who should have prevented all of this from happening in the first place. And there you have it, the plot of Nosferatu. If there's a strange taste of déjà vu swirling around in your mouth with all the blood, there's a reason for that. Let's take a look at why we're still discussing this movie 100 years after its release.
The good bits.
Nosferatu presents the vampire in its most accurate physical form. Vampire folklore goes back to the Middle Ages and it's tied directly to plague outbreaks. It was common for plague victims to have bleeding lesions around their lips. Now, as a species, historically, we human beings have been known to jump to conclusions from time to time when we don't fully understand things. And when these poor souls started bleeding from their mouths, of course they were accused of being vampires. I'm just glad we've evolved past that sort of frenzied, primitive behavior in the 21st century. My point is, you wouldn't want to be in the room with Max Schreck when he was in character, and that's exactly right. If you watch Nosferatu closely, you'll notice Count Orlok only blinks once in the entire movie. Was that written into the script? Of course it wasn't. That was Max Schreck committing to the character. Vampires are supposed to be outside of God's grace. They're vile and diseased and cursed beings. They don't belong on fashion runways or in exclusive clubs. They definitely should never, ever fucking sparkle. 100 years later, and Count Orlok's image is iconic among a collection of vampiric icons. You could argue Bela Lugosi's the true icon, and don't get me wrong, in a lot of ways he is, as is evidenced by the oversized framed image of him on the wall 4 feet behind me as I'm writing this. The same could be said for Christopher Lee, and Kate Beckinsale, and Gary Oldman, and Frank Langella. But all these other portrayals were clean and crisp and articulate and sensual and debonair. In other words, Hollywood. Whereas Shrek's Count Orlok was more like one of the rats he commanded. He exemplifies a cursed being. You don't want to be near him, and you definitely don't want to be like him. Nosferatu isn't an easy movie to review because it's unprecedented in so many ways. They had no money, they had no support from online campaigns, and in movie-making terms, they had nothing to follow. So everything you see is by definition innovative. And as such, how can you critique it for breaking new ground? And not just new ground, but highly influential new ground. The movie's filled with long cuts, and many of the shots linger the way Count Orlok himself does. And this draws you into the scenes in the absence of sound effects or dialogue. And it works. The movie also adjusts the camera speed in certain situations to create uncanny movement. And of course, by today's standard, you'd get laughed out of the theater for pulling a Benny Hill in a horror movie. But again, they had nothing in the way of technology, so they worked with what they had. Nosferatu doesn't bombard you with cheap jump scares either. They just don't work without the accompanying sounds. So instead, Nosferatu buries you under a dirty blanket of dread that you can't get out from under. It's sincerely creepy in a way very few modern horror movies are. And I'll take creepy over jump scares every single time.
The shite bits.
There's only one thing you can call this movie out for, and it's a biggie. The story was somebody else's. Nosferatu is 100% copyright infringement. There's plenty of information available online and elsewhere detailing the issue, but essentially, a German artist named Grau wanted to make a vampire movie in 1916. So he hired F.W. Murnau to direct it. Grau wanted to make an expressionistic version of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, but Bram's widow Florence said no. So Grau ignored her and changed the title and the character names and the locations. And shortly after the film was released in 1922, he was hit with a lawsuit anyways. All copies of the movie were ordered destroyed, and all of them were destroyed except for a single copy that somehow managed to find its way to America, where the copyright law wouldn't apply.
The verdict.
So, if you haven't seen Nosferatu yet, should you watch it? If you consider yourself a horror fan, I consider this movie requisite viewing. Yes, it's black and white, and yes, it's silent, but it's also something very unique because it's horror before horror was a commodity. When you watch it, you really feel the movie's paying respect to the novel and the vampiric folklore, whereas horrors nowadays are more focused on filming their young, hot Hollywood actors' faces from as many angles as possible. There's a real sincerity to Nosferatu, and sincerity with modern horror, unfortunately, seems to be going up in a poof of smoke like Count Orlok himself. Not to mention, you can watch this movie right here, right now, free of charge on YouTube. So quit being so lazy, horror fans. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that thing you just watched. If you enjoyed it, go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe. And if you want to watch another thing, there's one right there. Do it!